Hello there, and welcome to the weekly Outside Views magazine on politics in Africa and Arabia. In Israel, the formation of a government by the designated Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is proving difficult, despite the clear majority of his right-wing alliance in the Knesset, that's the Israeli parliament. President Isaac Herzog complied with a request from Netanyahu on Friday and extended the deadline for assembling a new cabinet by 10 days to December 21st. According to the law, Netanyahu should have presented his list of ministers and the goals of his government by Sunday at the latest. According to media reports, the planned coalition partners are fighting over ministerial posts and also over responsibilities. There are difficult days in which disputes over fundamental issues threaten to tear Israel's society apart and ignite violence and hatred, said Herzog, explaining the extension of the deadline. Netanyahu had said he needed more time to settle open issues, such as the roles for his partners. In the parliamentary elections at the beginning of November, the bloc of right-wing conservatives, ultra-right and religious forces led by Netanyahu won 64 of the 120 seats in the Knesset. Netanyahu has been prime minister several times. He is currently on trial on corruption charges, which he denies. The alliance he led would mean a clear shift to the right in the government. The election became necessary after an 8-party coalition led by Yair Lapid lost its majority after just 12 months in the summer. A Ukrainian donation of 25,000 tons of wheat for food aid in Ethiopia has arrived in neighboring Djibouti. This was announced by the Ukrainian embassy in Ethiopia's capital Addis Ababa on Monday. The grain is reloaded in the port of Doraleh in Djibouti and transported overland to Ethiopia. A second ship, which was currently being loaded with a further 30,000 tons of wheat in the port of Chornomorsk in Ukraine, was supposed to set sail for Ethiopia last week. This will be followed by a third shipment of 25,000 tons of wheat to neighboring Somalia, where famine is looming. In total, Ukraine plans to send more than 60 grain shipments to countries hardest hit by the current hunger crisis, including Sudan, South Sudan, Kenya, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and to Yemen. The German federal government is supporting the ship transport of the Ukrainian wheat donation to Ethiopia with $14 million. According to Federal Agriculture Minister Cem Özdemir from the Greens, 1.6 million people in the country on the Horn of Africa can be fed for a whole month. The grain will be distributed through the United Nations World Food Programme, the WFP. Ukraine is the world's 4th largest grain exporter, but has struggled to ship the grain out of the country since the Russian war of aggression began. The head of the Israeli Bar Association, Avi Chimi, has warned that a new right-wing religious government under Benjamin Netanyahu could endanger democracy. In the Haaretz newspaper, the lawyer referred to far-reaching steps to weaken the judicial system announced by members of the emerging new government. In the November 1st election, as I earlier mentioned, the right-wing religious camp of the long-serving former prime minister won 64 out of the 120 seats. And Netanyahu, who is the subject of a corruption trial, is likely to return to power after a year and a half in opposition. He has already reached an agreement in principle with several partners, but as I said, he now needs the extension I mentioned at the start of the video to form his government. It is expected that the new government will introduce an escape clause. This would allow a majority in parliament to enforce laws even if the Supreme Court classifies them as illegal. This means that the government cannot be reined in or controlled, Chimi warned. They want to do whatever they want, he says. In this case, Israel can no longer be classified as a democracy. Before the new government is sworn in, a change in the law is to be pushed through that would enable the leader of the strictly religious Shas party, Ari Deri, to become interior minister despite a conviction for tax violations. Other ministerial posts are also to be filled with controversial politicians. According to media reports, the previous coalition agreements grant Bezalel Smotrich of the religious Zionist party far-reaching powers to facilitate the expansion of Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. Avi Maoz, who ran in the election with a homophobic agenda, is said to be responsible for external programs at Israeli schools. Numerous headmasters and municipalities have already made it clear that they will oppose the curtailment of liberal content. Itamar Ben-Gvir, convicted of supporting a terrorist organization, is said to become Minister of National Security. Should the right-wing politician try to change the status quo on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and, for example, allow Jews to pray there, a further escalation in relations with the Palestinians and Jordan is to be expected. 2.37 million people are affected by the hunger crisis in the East African country of Kenya. Since 2020, the number of people affected by acute hunger has almost tripled. According to the aid organization Plan International, women and girls make up 70% of the hungry worldwide because they often eat after the male family members and therefore less. The hunger crisis is above all a water crisis. The rainy seasons of the past 3 years have been far too inefficient. Not only is there a lack of water to irrigate the fields, but also drinking water for animals and people. Fetching water is also traditionally the task of women and girls. The distances they have to cover are getting longer and longer, and what they then find is often not enough. Searching for water and doing housework makes them more susceptible to waterborne diseases. Access to clean water and sanitary facilities is particularly important for pregnant, breastfeeding, and menstruating women, as is an adequate supply of nutrients. No food, no water, no money, but more violence. In hunger crises, physical and especially sexual violence against women increases. This is also shown by a study by Plan International in Marsabit County, which is just as badly affected by hunger as Garissa, for example. 12% of the girls interviewed there reported rape and 17% sexual harassment, 15% domestic violence. At the same time, more than half of those surveyed said they had no access to health services, and those who do often cannot afford to make use of them. In addition, the women can hardly defend themselves. Traditional patriarchal structures are being reinforced by the drought crisis, and many women are dependent on their husbands. It is significantly more difficult for women to own land in their name. Men are more likely to have access to bank accounts. Because they have to look after the children, mothers have a harder time finding paid work. According to the United Nations World Food Programme, families in rural areas are particularly affected by the hunger crisis and are dependent on agriculture. If there is nothing more to get from their own fields because of the lack of water, the mothers have to earn money elsewhere. The care of the younger siblings is then usually the task of the older girls. They also have to take on more responsibility for other household chores, such as finding water. Large herds of wild elephants and chimpanzees used to live in the rainforests of Ghana and Ivory Coast. Today, these rare species are on the brink of extinction in both countries. The reason is the destruction of their habitat, the tropical rainforest. Sacrificed for cocoa cultivation, says Keisha Cheampong from the development organization Inkota. Accordingly, almost all of the cocoa in Ivory Coast comes from areas that were rainforests just a few years ago. Cocoa cultivation is a key driver of deforestation in cocoa-growing regions. This is particularly the case in West Africa, the main cocoa-growing region. According to the organization, one reason for the destruction is the poor pay of the cocoa farmers. According to Inkota, because the cocoa prices are so low and income is too low, many cocoa farmers are clearing the forest areas in order to be able to grow and sell more cocoa, and thus increase their income. Like other environmental and human rights organizations, the Inkota network sees the chocolate industry as primarily irresponsible. Large manufacturers such as Nestle, Lindt and Sprüngli, and Milka maker Mondelez have now even launched their own sustainability programs. So it will be difficult for consumers who want to buy and enjoy chocolate without a guilty conscience. Recognized certificates can provide orientation. Environmental and human rights organizations are also pinning their hopes on the supply chain law, which will come into force here in Germany on January 1st. It is intended to make the origin of raw materials transparent and traceable. Basically, it's about the value of the chocolate and the question of who earns from it. The worldwide turnover of the chocolate industry is estimated at 110 billion US dollars a year. According to calculations by Inkota, however, cocoa farmers receive just 7% of the selling price of a regular bar of chocolate. This is far from enough to cover the costs of growing and caring for the cocoa trees, harvesting, transport, and the cocoa farmers' wages. Expensive food and cuts in humanitarian aid. According to Doctors Without Borders, more and more children are affected by malnutrition in Yemen. Between January and October, the aid organization treated 36% more girls and boys compared to the same period last year, according to a statement on Friday. In the first 10 months of this year, almost 7,600 affected children were cared for in the Médecins Sans Frontières facilities, or Doctors Without Borders. According to the aid organization, many people cannot afford enough food. Prices have risen because of the economic crisis in the country, and above all, those displaced by the civil war have no regular income. Since aid funds have been cut, the food and health care of the people in Yemen has also been further restricted. In a treatment center for malnourished people, the employees had to choose which of his 4 children would be helped. That's what the father reported, according to the announcement. Yemen is one of the poorest countries in the world. A civil war has been raging there since 2015, in which Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are fighting alongside the government against the Houthi rebels. According to the United Nations, more than 2 million children in the country are severely malnourished, hundreds of thousands of them in a life-threatening condition. Congolese Industry Minister Julien Paluku announced the new death toll of 272. Among the victims in North Kivu province were children who were killed in a church and in a hospital. Paluku was previously the governor of the embattled eastern province bordering Uganda and Rwanda. The minister also accused the M23 rebel group of being responsible for the November 29th attack in the city of Kishishe in the east of the countries. The rebel organization denies this. The government of the Democratic Republic of the Congo also stated that the rebels had forcibly recruited civilians in the region. In addition, the M23 was supported by members of the Rwandan army. Rwanda has always denied such allegations. On Sunday, people gathered in Congo to protest against the ongoing violence in the east of the country. After the services, Catholics in several parts of the country denounced the increasing balkanization of the Central African country by rebels. Now it is up to each individual to take responsibility and contribute to the peace of the country, emphasized the Bishop of Butembo Beni, Melchizedek Sikuli Paluku, according to a report by Radio Okapi. According to reports, the influential Congolese Bishops' Conference called for the protest marches. "We are fed up with the war," Bishop Dieudonné Uringi is quoted as saying in Ituri province. In the provincial capital Goma, the protest action had to be cancelled for security reasons. The United Nations said last week that it had received reports of high civilian casualties as a result of fighting between the M23 and local militias in Kishishe. The Congolese army and the M23, a militia led by the Tutsi group, have been fighting each other in the east of the country for months. 2 weeks ago, East African heads of state and government agreed on a ceasefire at a crisis summit. The M23 rebels were not part of the negotiations. Instead, they were offered the prospect of enforcing the peace if necessary. Fighting continued even after the ceasefire was announced. Kenya and other East African countries are currently assembling a regional strike force for Eastern Congo. And that concludes this week's magazine on African and Arabian news. I'll see you on that format next week, but tomorrow on my next video here. I'll see you in my next video. I'll be back.